So hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Rachel Jolie, and I am the engagement editor for Belt Magazine. I'm really excited to get to introduce this event tonight. I'm speaking to you from so-called Cleveland, Ohio, also on Erie and Mississauga land. If you missed there's a link in the chat. If you're not sure what native land you're on, you can look that up and take some time to research about the original stewards of the land that you call home, if you're not familiar yet. Before I hand it over to Deondre and the rest of these amazing panelists for this Indigenous Rust Belt series that we are hosting this event around, I am going to tell you briefly about Belt Magazine and what we are all about in case you're not familiar. So Belt Magazine is a digital publication by and for the Rust Belt and Greater Midwest. The publication was founded by Anne Trubeck in 2013 as an antidote to shallow, distorted representations of the region. And we pursue that mission through the features, essays, poetry, and photography we publish on our website at beltmag.com. The goal is to tell a story of the region by and for and with the people who live here, including all the complexities and nuances, and viewing that all through a critical lens. This work goes beyond the stories we publish. Our team works to foster a larger conversation about the past, present, and future of the Rust Belt and Greater Midwest, engaging regional communities through events like this, partnerships, and other projects. You can find out more about our work on our website at beltmag.com. I'll put that in the chat if it's not there already. You can join our newsletter email list to stay up to date with our stories and other events. And if you want to help us keep paying writers and panelists to be able to keep publishing stories and hosting events like this, you can also donate or become a member there. So with that said, I'm, like I said, so excited to get to hand this over to Deondre Smiles, and also a big thanks to Ohio Humanities, who helped us with a grant to support this whole series of work that we're doing around Indigenous voices in the Rust Belt. And you can find that also on a page that I will drop a link to in a moment once I stop talking, because as I've learned in this era of Zooming, I cannot speak to Zoom and copy paste things in a chat at the same time. So I will do that when I stop talking. So thank you again, everybody, for being here. I am going to hand it over to Deondre, and thank you again to all the panelists and attendees. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Good evening, everyone, or if you are on the West Coast like me, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to see so many people here this evening / afternoon. I'll take a second to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Deondre Smiles. I am a citizen of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, and I am of Anishinaabe, Black, and of settler descent. I originally hail from this city known as Minneapolis, or as we know it in Ojibwe Moen, Gakabikang. My connection to the Rust Belt is that I spent 3 years living in Duluth, Minnesota, on the far western tip of what we know as the Rust Belt. I also spent 4 years as a PhD student in geography. I hold a PhD in geography from The Ohio State University, which I have as my background, as well as spending a year in the history department as a postdoc. And so I'm really just excited to have a chance to share with you some of the amazing work that has been done as part of our Indigenous Rust Belt project here at Belt. I've had the honor of serving as a guest editor for this project here for most of the last year. For those of you that have been reading the magazine, you've seen a number of the pieces coming out. Just to give you a heads up, we are not done with the series yet. We have some more pieces. We just had a piece come out the other day. We have more pieces coming out here in the coming months, but tonight we want to share with you the words and the knowledge and the wisdom of 3 of our contributors to the project. And so tonight we'll be hearing from Brad Kasberg, Dr. Katie Phillips, and Jillian Joseph, and they'll be taking some time to talk about their pieces that they've contributed to the series. And then we'll have some time for some questions. I'll pose a few questions, and then we'll have the balance of the talk tonight, about the last 30 minutes, for questions and answers from audience members. I do ask that if you think of questions, please do use the Q&A function when doing so. And looking forward to just hearing having some really great conversations tonight. And so I will start off by introducing our first speaker tonight. Brad Kasberg is a citizen of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma, and he currently is a sustainable landscape specialist at the Argonne National Lab. And Brad wrote a really, really amazing piece about Dungeons and Dragons and how they can connect to Miami resurgence. And so with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Brad to go ahead and to share a little bit about your piece.
Newe, Kinjasata Wayneswane, Nila Miami Metosenia, Eminutane Shikakonge. My name is Brad Casberg. As Deondre mentioned, I am a citizen of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma. I'm currently living in Chicago, Shikakonge. My piece was, as you mentioned, focused on Dungeons and Dragons. I am new to it, though I'm not new to nerdery in general. But I kind of came to the game early last year, and through this process that I wrote about. I want to read a section of it, but I'm going to basically read the second half. So I just want to provide the initial context of it, where myself and some of my cousins went on a trip together to southern, what is now Indiana, to spend time together. We did the whole quarantine thing, and then met up in 2020, end of 2020, I suppose. So we did that, and it was a wonderful, absolutely life-changing experience. And it got me thinking, and it got me thinking about place, and it got me thinking about how to occupy our spaces, our historical landscape in ways that we may not have been able to in the past, especially in the age of the ever-present Zoom webinar and video conferencing. So with that, I will just jump into my piece. Visiting important places in the Midwest is complicated, to say the least. There's a detached defensiveness I feel when my people's history is erased or delegated to a footnote, when we are depicted as a savage enemy, or worse, obstacles. There's heartbreak when places of cultural importance are locked behind private property, flooded by dams, or outright destroyed by development and agriculture. I know I'll never see some places that are central to our community, despite their prevalence in our stories, because they are now underwater. I can only dream of what they look like. At other sites, we must make do, paying respect to our history in industrial corridors or untended lots. Several places have been protected by the community, and for that we are grateful for their resilience. But for the most part, the landscape has drastically changed from how our stories describe it. But removal did not completely separate us from our homelands. It just changed how we interacted with it. We're limited by space and time in the ways that we can interact, though we are always finding ways to do so. Even in the years immediately following our removal, community members traveled back and forth between the new reservation in Kansas and our homelands, where a few families still were able to remain. That trend follows to this day, with annual trips spanning the diaspora, continually maintaining the threads that keep us together. Naturally, due to all these difficulties, much of our communal experience became temporary and conceptual. Following the loss of knowledge bearers and native speakers of our language in the 20th century, storytelling reignited our ability to learn and share among each other, a way to reconnect with threads that may have been frayed or lost over time. Consequently, the collective reimagination of our history and our future as Miami-Ake, Miami people, became a central part of our community's linguistic and cultural revitalization. Storytelling plays a central role in this because so much knowledge is embedded in stories, and they are presented in a relatively familiar, digestible format. While there are nuances to Miami storytelling, people can gather together, retell our stories, and take up physical space as Miami-Ake, regardless of their familiarity. Telling, hearing, and discussing these stories lets us collectively explore what it means to be Miami together. This can happen anytime, anywhere. Yes, stories are tied to specific places, which breathe so much life into the stories, but they can at least be experienced anywhere that Miami-Ake are. While in-person oral storytelling is a long-standing communal event in the winter when traditional stories are allowed to be told, most often our active storytelling is achieved through other media these days. Our tribe creates books, maps, photo albums, all kinds of digital media on all subjects. Community blogs have been a long-standing piece of our digital presence, and because of COVID, video conferencing has become integral to generating conversations across a wider spectrum of community members than ever before. We're not bound by traditional means of community building. No tribe has ever been bound by history. We're constantly adapting and changing, and we're constantly creating new ways to pick up and share our threads of knowledge. That is why, after our camping trip along the Kanzenze Seepaway, the Ohio River, I was inspired to push our community storytelling and gathering into a new direction. There are too many of us across the country eager to learn our language, to share our arts and crafts, and to spend time together in an easy, unstructured, and fun way. We just want to have fun and grow together. I wanted a space where we could gather that could imitate the feeling of being together at a campsite, exploring a new place together as Miamiake. I wanted to engage and inspire something that went outside of the time we could even spend together digitally. I wanted something that would let people speak plainly so that we could all work on improving our language together. After considering my options and my closest relatives who would likely participate, I suggested a Dungeons and Dragons campaign using traditional Miamia stories and culture as the foundations of the world. As I settled in as Dungeon Master, the creator of the setting and the teller of the narrative who guides the players through the world, I learned that the same issues we have in Illinois, in Indiana, and in Ohio persist in the realms of Dungeons and Dragons. That is, the dominant narratives and structures in which we are exposed do not reflect Miamia beliefs or practices. For many, Dungeons and Dragons is about combat and heroism, which are all valid and fun prospects. But from a Miamia perspective, who can even be a hero, and what is considered a heroic deed? What does it mean to be a good Miamia person, and what makes a person pick up a weapon or a spell book and commit an act of violence against somebody or something else? Damsels in distress, treating non-humans as enemies by their very nature, the concept of might is right, and the allures of hoards of treasure. These are tropes that just don't easily align with Miamia perspectives. The sense of ego that is normally pervasive in Dungeons and Dragons is often present in Miamia stories only to serve as a target of vicious mockery. The reframing of a world to emphasize relationships with non-humans and to redistribute political and social power in non-Western ways became a deeper undertaking than I originally expected. As I further developed the world and its lore, I started to notice that what I was doing in the game reflected how we navigate the real world. I dreamed up a world filled with people similar to our tribe, pre-removal, where our community was intact and in control of our homelands. Colonial powers loomed, but the landscape was identifiably a Miamia one. Even here, I couldn't imagine a non-colonized landscape. This is an imagined, idealized past within which we escape the real difficulties of living in a diaspora. From this idealized past, I am trying to create with my relatives an idealized future, a vision of what we want our communities to look like. Maybe not for us, but for future generations. Here, sentient beings and spirits are not enemies, but relatives we can interact with and learn from. The players are free to roam, to visit relatives, form bonds with and serve communities, mediate disputes, dance, sing, and just try to be good Miamiake. Will the stories we build together over the computer screen ever make their way into stories told over the fire? Sovereignty is the authority to tell our own story, our own vision of who we are, where we come from, and what we will be. Our stories weave us, our land, and our futures together, and we tell these stories out of love. I hold no particular attachment to the state of Indiana, but to the land and waters of the Wabash and Ohio rivers and their tributaries. There's a heartbeat and a consciousness resting in the land that we awaken when we gather together and create a uniquely Miamia space. That is the power of our stories and the art of storytelling. They cannot help but reinforce our connection to the land and to each other. Ketwe kate ishilani ikwe, I often ask my players after setting the scene in an unfamiliar space. What do you intend to do? In response, they may surprise me and fumble in their bags in search of digital copies of medicinal plants. But no matter what they find, I know they'll ultimately do the same thing that our ancestors did. Hold on to the threads and let the story take each player wherever they need to go. We'll find each other. Ehingi. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's give Brad a virtual round of applause. All right, I will now turn it to our next panelist. Dr. Katie Phillips is a citizen of the Red Cliff Band of Ojibwe. She is an assistant professor of Native History and the History of the American West at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. And she also wrote a really, really wonderful piece that talks about place names, Ojibwe place names, and the ways that they are marked or made invisible on Midwestern/Rust Belt landscapes. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Phillips.
Thank you, Dr. Smiles. So Bujuni Jiwag, Bangi Tagoni Natan Nishnabe Medash Ninga Nishnabe Gagi Ged Ajana, Niminwenda Mayawan Amanungum, Ganuj Ogimakwe, Nindijna Kaz Nishnabe Mang, and Dash Katrina Phillips, Nindijna Kaz Jaganashimang, Makwan and Dodem, Minawa Misklabi Kong, and Mindigay Beat guys. So hello, my friends. I only speak a little Ojibwe, but I'll speak Ojibwe for a little while. I'm glad to be here today. Tall Chief Woman is what I am known as in Ojibwe, and Katrina Phillips is my English name. I'm from the Bear Clan and I'm enrolled at Red Cliff. I want to thank Rachel and all the folks at Belt Magazine for having us here tonight. Thank you to Dr. Smiles for the encouragement with writing these pieces. And so I'm going to kind of excerpt mine, just kind of pull a couple pieces together. But I was the inspiration for this is honestly, it's COVID, there's not really a whole lot to do. And so, my husband and I couldn't handle being stuck in the house anymore. We would throw our kids and the dog in the car and just drive. And so that got me thinking, I'm a historian, I'm not a geographer, but I've always been fascinated by the names of places, where they come from, who does the naming, how does, what's the power in naming and things like that. And so that was kind of the inspiration for this piece. And so I'll start watching the clock and I will just kind of read you a little bit from that. And so the origin story of the Ojibwe is steeped in our ancestors' westward migrations. We used to live on the way eastern part of Turtle Island, but a prophecy told us that another people, a light-skinned people, would come to our shore and bring violence and destruction to our people. After a great council was held, we started moving westward. The first of 7 prophecies told us to look for an island that looked like a turtle, and we found it in what's now the Ottawa River near what's now known as Montreal in Canada. The second stopping point was Gitchagakabikan, the place of thunderwater, Niagara Falls. The vision next took us to Wawiantanong, or what's now the Detroit River. The next vision told us to look for a place where we could step across the great waters. The largest of these stepping stones or islands was Manitoulin Island in Lake Huron. The 5th stop was Bowitagon, or Sault Ste. Marie. Here the people split. Some went north around Gitchigami or Lake Superior, and others went south around the Great Lake. The southern group made their way all the way to Lake Superior and stopped near what's now called Duluth, named after the French explorer Daniel Greysolin, the Sieur de Luth. This place was called Wiquidon, and it was the first place where we found the food that grows on water, wild rice. The 7th and final stop was what people now call Madeline Island, part of the Apostle Islands in what's now the northernmost part of Wisconsin. Indigeneity is embedded in the land. Our origin stories, our histories, our languages, and our cultures are tied to where we come from, where our families and our ancestors trace their footsteps or their travels. The very thing that distinguishes Indigenous people from settler societies, Dina Gilio Whitaker contends, is their unbroken connection to ancestral lands. The idea of place, what it means, what's it called, and by whom, is integral to how we position ourselves literally and figuratively in a particular space. It's how we define our relationship to a place, how we claim ownership or knowledge. To be from somewhere is to claim and be claimed. Names of cities, towns, lakes, rivers, and mountains hold stories and histories of people, of journeys, of violence. From the Minnesota cities like Minnetonka, Mankato, and Winona, whose names come from Native words and Native places, to the road names on Wisconsin reservations. The acts of naming, of renaming, of reclaiming underscore these contested complexities. The geographic conflation of Native nations and their homelands is also a historical process, one that elides, if not outright ignores, the histories of forced land cessions and forced removals. The act of naming and the power inherent in that choice forces us to reckon with what it means to name a place after a Native nation whose place-based history is hundreds or thousands of miles away. The act of place naming is not as obvious, insidious, or explicitly violent as wars, genocide, or forced removal. But the erasure of Native people remains a deeply rooted element of this history. They may seem innocuous, but the names of the places where we live and work, the places we travel to and through, are tied to the lingering legacies of Native and settler colonial interactions. Our deliberate removal from these places by agents of settler colonialism, the Indian agents, the land speculators, the missionaries, the militaries, the government officials, and the settlers who followed, was intended to erase us from the landscape. For Native people, our geographies proclaim, as Natchez Blue Barn contends, we are still here in a most grounded way. Our geographies are tied to our memories, to the stories we hear, the stories we tell, and the stories we never got to hear. Our connections to place help us identify who we are and who our ancestors were. So much of it, Stacy Lola Driard writes, has to do with being from somewhere, of being able to trace the history and footsteps of those who came before us. Settler colonialism removes our ability to trace our relationship and responsibility to our land, making it harder to know what it means to grow up learning how to gather and prepare wild rice or gather maple sap for syrup, to use the land the way our ancestors did. But our places and our names for those places survive. They survive in the way that we as Native people are not only surviving, but thriving. The reclamation of lands and place names are tied to the language and cultural revitalization, food sovereignty, and Indigenous environmentalism. The legacies of the land are part of who we are, just as we are part of the land. Miigwech, thank you.
Miigwech, thank you so much, Dr. Phillips. Let's get a virtual round of applause for the powerful work that she's doing. All right, last but not least, I want to introduce our third panelist for tonight. Jillian Joseph is Ihanktuan in Mid-Washington, Dakota. They work as a sustainable they work in Indigenous health education with the Center for World Indigenous Studies. And Jillian has written a really, really powerful poem about the Treaty of Mendota, which is a very, very important document when talking about the histories of settler colonialism and relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in the Twin Cities region and in the Minnesota and Mississippi River valleys. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Jillian.
Thank you, Dr. Smiles. Yeah, I'm really excited and happy to have been invited to be on this panel. And Wilpita for everyone sharing their work so far. It's really great to hear. Mine is obviously much shorter because it's a pretty short poem. So I'll add a little bit of context to it, I guess, before. So yeah, as Dr. Smiles mentioned, my poem is not only about the Treaty of Mendota, but it's actually all words that are found in the treaty. So I became interested in archival work and going through archives and federal documents maybe a year or two ago. And, through this research, I wanted to learn more about my ancestors and other people who are Ihangtawa and Midwakaton, and sort of, like geography around it and like how we have moved over time and how we've been forced into movement. And of course, I'm sure many of us know that treaties are never honored, even though they're supposed to be like living documents and they're supposed to have some sort of like forbearance on how the US interacts with Indigenous people today. So one of my ancestors was coerced into signing this treaty, and I became really interested in it from like a poetic and like a writer standpoint of, well, how can I take these words and create something that speaks more to probably the experience that my ancestor and other Dakota people had, and that this treaty was, what basically forced us out of the rest of the land that we had stewardship over in Minnesota, and onto reservations. So hopefully that is kind of a better understanding going into it. So yeah, I'll read the poem now. So, Treaty of Mendota, August 5th, 1851. In consideration of the occupied, Congress's mouth shall black instructions. Rights relinquished to, treaty wants, the Indians, the dollars, farms of sums and chiefs, former peace of the country, 1,000 thousands set apart by the boundaries of Dakota, Minnesota, united the Sioux, the rivers said, a spirituous reservation bounded on the west to balance out conditions perpetual with consent of stricken. 10 cents per acre to force their hands in Midwakaton and Wapekute lands, undersigned my ancestor. Lupita.
Thank you so much, Jillian. Let's get one more virtual round of applause for Jillian. A very, very powerful piece. All right, so I'm gonna start off our Q&A session by asking a round of questions. I'll ask one per each panelist. And I'll start with Brad. So Brad, in reading your piece and then listening to you as you talk through the piece again, you spoke about kind of grappling with the colonial sort of legacies that are inherent even in a tabletop role-playing game like Dungeons and Dragons, right? A game that we view as, being an escape, but even for Indigenous peoples playing this game, as you point out, sometimes we might be confronted with the same legacies as we face in real life. And so the question that I pose for you is that, what might a decolonial, or as I prefer, like an anti-colonial framing of Dungeons and Dragons, what might that look like for applications of the game, even outside of Indigenous contexts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so. I'm merely one attempt at doing this. There are other people running Dungeons and Dragons sessions. There's a big one. It's called NDND, which is like an all native led Dungeons and Dragons thing you could watch on like YouTube and stuff like that. They broadcast it. But there's other games as well that are thinking those same thoughts. Coyote and Crow is like a science fiction fantasy game where basically the Americas were never colonized, and it's a technological future of Indigenous nations. There's a handful of others that exist that ask that question. To me, I think the biggest thing is taking an approach of rethinking what rethinking even the idea of enemies, or rethinking of conflict and ways to resolve it. The problem is even deeper than Dungeons and Dragons, right? Because you think of Dungeons and Dragons typically related to video games. In video games, you're the hero, you go out and you do everything. And so there's that like Latin ego that's just really hard to untwine from play. So it's difficult. Even talking about this with folks in my tribe that I'm playing with, we really struggle with that and thinking like, oh, only I can do this. Only we as a group can solve this problem. We're going to go in. But yeah, I mean, in general, I think about it as just subverting expectations of who and what has power. For instance, it wouldn't be a surprise for any Indigenous person on this seminar. You walk into a village and odds are one of the people that everyone's going to defer to is an older woman, an elder woman. You're not going to see that typically in a video game. So subverting those expectations of who has power, who can provide power, and how power manifests, I think is something to really reconsider and reevaluate in games. Just because you can swing a sword doesn't mean you can save the world. So listening to people and acting together intelligently is the more important thing. Not that combat is irrelevant, even in our games, but there's appropriate times and places to behave in that way, and there are times where it's obviously not the best course of action.
Thank you so much, Brad. I feel inspired to join a Dungeons and Dragons game myself. It sounded like so much fun. Maybe we can get a Anishinaabe one started.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So thank you for that. All right, my next question is for Dr. Phillips. And so speaking as a fellow Ojibwe from the upper Midwest, one of the things that we are seeing from state governments, state departments of transportation in Minnesota and increasingly in Wisconsin, right? Actually, I think Red Cliff and Bad River are actually among the first nations in Wisconsin to do this, is we're starting to see on place name signs name their names in the local indigenous language. So in Minnesota, we see a lot of signs now with Anishinaabe names alongside the English name, and then we see that similarly in some of the nations in Wisconsin, and people have held that up as kind of a good example of making people aware of the histories of these places and making them aware that they were not always named these things and that these might mean different sorts of things. The indigenous geographer in me wants to ask, what kinds of steps would you like to see state governments take in order to further increase this sort of awareness, right? And we could probably talk about that for hours upon hours, but if there was one or two really key takeaways that if the governors of Minnesota and Wisconsin were sitting with you and you wanted to let them know what they could be doing, what might those things be?
Oh, that is such a fantastic question. And you're right, we could talk about that for a long time. I think it sounds strange to say this, but I think what I would like to see from state governors is very explicit support of this. Not that, Red Cliff doesn't need, the governor's approval to do this, right? We are sovereign nations, but it's one thing for the sign to go up, and that's all well and good. But to have local and state officials celebrating it and recognizing it and bringing attention to it, I think would be a fantastic way to show support and to underscore why this matters, right? Because for the folks, that admittedly, there aren't a lot of folks who like drive through Redcliffe, right? Because you can't really go any farther north because there's a giant lake in the way. But to be able to drive and to see this sign and for it to start to resonate with people, right? One thing, I absolutely adore seeing this sign. I think you sent it to me and I think you tweeted it at me the first time it went up. And I feel so much pride in knowing that our language is on this sign. And to think about where else we could do this, right? And just to have it be expected and not just kind of like a one-off on this, tiny little res up in northern Wisconsin. So it's probably not as eloquent as I was going for, but that was kind of the first thought that came to mind, would be to see that broader public support, right? And acknowledgement of it.
No, I think that's really, really well stated. I remember one of my cover photos on my Facebook profile for a very long time, and I think I'll probably put it back up on my Twitter, was the signs that are put up on the boundaries of my tribe's reservation in on our boundaries, and it had our name for our reservation on the top, right? Gazagasquajimikag, or the Leech Lake Reservation. And it was one of the coolest things, right? To just kind of see that name and see that being used rather than the English name that's been used for a long time. And so, yeah, I think that's something that I would love to see state leaders celebrate more. And of course, these are sovereign nations. We don't need the state government to approve things or to speak for us, but in the settler colonial state and with this relationship that we've been placed in relation to the federal government and the states, getting their support is important nonetheless. So thank you for those thoughts. And then I guess for Jillian, when writing this poem and working with the treaty, having kind of done like some work related to kind of working with the archival materials, related to some of my own people, there's oftentimes kind of very visceral kind of emotions and very and kind of things that we go through with working for this sorts of things. And so to the extent that you feel comfortable sharing, what were kind of your experiences with working, with the Treaty of Mendota to write this poem?
Yeah. So for me, obviously, like when I first was able to like read it and access it and discover that one of my ancestors had signed it, which I had known from like someone telling someone, and like it kind of gets passed on to you, and it's like a story within your like community and like the diaspora of your community. So like my first time sitting down and reading it, it was shocking and not shocking to see like what is stipulated in it. I mean, a lot of times I'm sure many Indigenous people can relate, and I'm sure other people can too, to reading like census documents. So it reminded me a lot of like how census documents treat Native people and like the special inquiry sections of census documents, and also like on allotment documents, if you've ever read those. The language towards Native people is so just like dehumanizing, and it's very like, for me, it reads as like being sneaky in a way and like deceptive, which of course it is. Yeah, and I think the part that speaks to that is a lot of times like at the end of treaties, instead of like someone writing a name or giving their actual consent, it's like a mark, which is the case for this treaty. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of grief that you go through when you read things like this, and you see how you've been failed time and time again. Especially knowing that this is a treaty that was really kind of like a pivotal moment in leading up to like the Dakota Wars. And, for me also, like a huge part of this treaty, I think a lot of people, when you like Google it or look up about it, talk about the money, which was I don't even know, like $1 million and something dollars, which what is that to like your homeland? So it's nothing. But like the biggest part for me was that in return for signing the treaty, 5 prisoners who were Dakota were released from prison that they had been held at for a long time. So yeah, like when I was thinking about this, I think that, you know, there is no like negotiation process that's actually ever happened in the history of the United States. There is just like taking. There's, you know, imperialism and fascism and all of these things that crush like the words that we would say, that our ancestors might have said. And so it was actually really healing in a way to take this and like transcribe it by hand. And then basically I put it into like randomized, like a randomizing generator. So I put all the words in and just scrambled them all. And I did it again and again and again. And I would read through it and look at the words and decide how I wanted to use them. So it was really empowering in that way. Yeah, it was also inspired by Jordan Abel's book called Engine, which takes a lot of, well, it's based all off of texts from like 1850 to 1940, I want to say, for these like Western like cowboy novels. And, you know, it's like all of these words that are found and then repurposed. So it was an empowering thing to do.
Well, again, I thank you for sharing your words with us. Very powerful indeed. So I want to open this up now to the audience. And so in order to ask questions, if you can put them into the Q&A section, I will go ahead and I will pose the questions to the panelists as we go along. And so we have one in the Q&A section already. This is from Gretchen. Gretchen says, "Thank you all so much for your powerful words. I'm a white second-generation Polish woman and writer who was raised in the Rust Belt in Northwest Indiana, Chicago. And they write often about the area and frankly about their alienation from the landscapes. They mentioned their family had been there for one generation and they're more interested in writing thoughtfully about the indigenous aspects of this landscape. And they pose a question to all of the panelists. They ask, do you have any advice about going about this in a way that is authentic and not othering to Native or Indigenous peoples, and or any resources to share as they begin research in this area?"
I can take a stab at that. I mean, that's a tough question. I mean, I think having this mindset is certainly putting you on the right path, like steering you in the right direction. I think it's I think it's trying to find, in whatever ways that they exist, whether it's a written document or anything, community told histories. For example, Chief Pokagon was had quite a bit of writing and essays from I think the early 1900s or late 1800s. I'm blanking on the exact time, but he's a useful person for the region to sort of get a good sort of historical lens from. Beyond that, I mean, I think it's a matter of not writing about Native people as if, because we're treading this in sort of what we're talking about is like an idealized imaginary landscape, as if Native people are a part of it and not an agent of it. You know, it's a matter of writing about different Indigenous groups as being active storytellers and active implements of change and of balance within the political and ecological pieces of Northwest Indiana, for example. Yeah, and I think it's a matter of just digging through history, and there's tons of historical accounts by explorers, and it's very difficult to grab legitimate information from those. I feel like anytime I read through them, the more I'm knowledgeable about my own tribe, the more I can actually get from what they're saying, because it's an incredibly ignorant perspective that they're coming from. So it's a long-winded, you know, that I don't have just one solid thing, but those are some of my thoughts on that matter.
I would step in and agree with a lot of what Brad said as well. I would say, you know, making sure to uplift the voices of the peoples about who will live in the region that you're writing about, and you know, both historical voices and contemporary voices, right? We think about the processes of removal and things like that, and removing people from the land, but that doesn't mean that their relationships with the land are severed, and so therefore, you know, even going to ranging from, you know, uplifting those accounts to even getting, you know, some community input and consultation in what you're writing about, you know, reaching out to those nations that inhabit it and still have relationships with that land, and getting their input about writing these sorts of things can really can really be an important, really first step, right? I'm always hesitant to kind of label anything as like, you know, the magic bullet for like doing ethical work with Indigenous nations, because it's always about communication and respect. But those things can go a really long way, and then, you know, doing things in a good way and doing things respectfully. Were there any thoughts that oh, I see Katie unmuted herself.
In addition to, you know, the really wonderful thoughts from Brad and from Dr. Smiles, I think it's crucial to remember that this is a history that is ongoing. It is not simply, you know, Native people in that region are not just simply people of the past. You know, I love, you know, Brad's suggestion about, you know, what does it mean to look at, you know, these accounts from explorers and things like that. And also, you know, thinking about, I'm a historian, right? I can't help this. But, you know, thinking about the history, yes, but then also thinking about the contemporary, right? What does it mean to think about the history of forced removal, but then also to think about what relocation in the 1950s did, right? How are the communities and the organizations that are there now a representative of this history of agency, right? Native people were not simply acted upon, they were very active participants, and looking at what does implicit resistance look like? What does, you know, how do our connections to that land not only draw on the historical context, but also how are they meaningful and how do they matter today?
All right, I have another question here that's addressed to all three panelists. And the question asks, what are your thoughts about the proposal that in the United States that national parklands be turned back over to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous nations?
I guess I can start maybe, or Katie, if you. I was just going to say that I think before you can even answer that question, which obviously I agree that Native people should have stewardship over all of our territory and lands, is how many sacred places have been put into national parks. You know, a lot of us can't practice ceremony, or we can't practice a deeper connection like on our lands because we cannot have like free access to those lands. You know, I think especially as someone who is Oceti Sakowin, the Badlands, you know, one of the most holy places, one of the most spiritual places, like literally the, you know, a central part of our creation story, we don't have access to, like in a way that we should, because it is considered to be like a national park, and multiple other of like the 7 sacred places, and a lot of like Oceti Sakowin oral storytelling is part of a national park. So, you know, like what does it look like instead of us being able to steward the land, we have to work for like a national park service or have permission to, you know, have our ceremonies and spend time that we need to spend with the land and with each other.
There's a lot of really fantastic scholarship that's been done on this history, thinking about Carl Jacobi, Mark David Spence. There are a number of others that I'm forgetting in this moment. But, you know, to add on to, you know, how Jillian has so beautifully described this relationship, right? The history of national parks, the creation of national parks is predicated on forced Indigenous removal from these places. There are a lot of accounts from, you know, the early years of Yosemite and Yellowstone of how even after the parks were founded, you have the military going in and forcibly removing Native peoples from their homelands. And so that history, right? And I'm not saying that to be sensationalist, right? You know, it is in the scholarship, it's in the historical records. And again, as Jillian said, the fact that so many sacred sites are now within these borders, and that people who want to, again, practice their ceremonies and, you know, who want to maintain these traditions have to do so by asking permission to access lands that are sacred. And it's one of those things where, you know, when I first saw that question, my like visceral response was kind of like, yes, like immediately, yes, like that was my first reaction because of that history and because of what Native people still have to do and all of the hoops they have to jump through in order to continue these ceremonies that they've done for hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah, just to echo all of that that you both have said, like absolutely. I also, I think it's a, I don't think it's a good idea. I think it's a necessary idea for that to happen. And an additional reason for that is I think in my experience and in my knowledge of Indigenous-led restoration efforts and stewardship, it's good at 2 important scales that I think a lot of times conventional colonial perspectives of restoration fail at. And that's the small scale, like the very personal, how am I interacting with this little stretch of river? How am I restoring this small section? And then the big. And I don't mean big like, you know, the run of a river. I mean, the migration pattern of, say, caribou, for example. I think or bison. There are different perspectives and timetables and strategies that have been woven into our lifestyles for, you know, time immemorial, but that allow us to really do the small and the large at the same time, and that just doesn't exist, I think, at a good enough level with non-Indigenous led restoration efforts. So there's the moral and the spiritual, and then I think there's the literal, like, does this work? Can we heal the land? Can we maintain the land in a good way approach as well?
Thank you all so much for this very, very thoughtful, very well-spoken answers. We have about 2 minutes left, and so I'm going to do one last question here to make sure that we can get out of here at a good time, especially with the snowstorm bearing down and it being close to 9 o'clock there on in the Eastern time zone. So the one attendee asked, has there been progress over the past 2 decades in integrating Indigenous voices perspectives in history, both contemporary and past, into public education across the US? And they're curious, can we see the impact anywhere in particular? And what more could be done? Just if we could get any thoughts you might be able to provide here in the last couple of minutes on that.
I can jump in. I know that my tribe, we have a very close relationship, as you can guess, with Miami University in Ohio, and through that connection, I mean, so much good has come out of that for our community. But there has been an integration of not just Miami history, but Indigenous history within Ohio, within Ohio's educational standards, and that's taken place in the past few years. I don't know to the degree of how widespread that is, but there's been work to integrate a more accurate and regionally appropriate representation of Indigenous history in elementary schools in Ohio.
So my husband and I have 2 kids. We've got an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. And honestly, one of the best things that I've seen is the rise in the number of books in children's literature that are by Native authors about Native issues and Native peoples and things like that. And we are obviously privileged to be able to do this, but every year I buy a couple books, for both of their classrooms, and talk with their teachers and offer suggestions about, like, oh, hey, like, it's November, can we maybe make sure we're not going to do any like Pilgrims and Indians things? And it's a very small scale thing, right? But I found that the sheer and incredible quality of the kidlit books that are coming out has been a really great place to start, and it gives a lot of teachers a place to start as well, because a lot of them are a little hesitant about how to teach it because they don't know how to teach it, and that's kind of been a good kind of nudge for us, if that helps.
Yeah, I think just to continue on with that, I think, yes, there has been steps towards elevating Native voices and Indigenous voices in, education. But I think most of, when we are educated is not usually in a formal setting. It's by parents and like elders, and it's through books and media. And I think you see more and more that there are Indigenous voices in books and in television, especially right now. And it seems like more people are starting to become a bit more aware of like the lands that they're residing on, and have more access maybe to like educational materials. But then there's another part of me who is like, as a two-spirit person, and as someone who's like kind of watched literature and media kind of like progress, that wishes there was a lot more breadth and like a lot more perspective besides just like usually sort of like a one-dimensional Native voice. Like I want to see more queer Native people, Black Native people, Two-Spirit Native people. So I think when we start having those voices, then like it'd be a resounding yes. I think people have more Indigenous education because, you know, just because you're knowing more about Indigenous people does not mean that you know a lot about Indigenous people, especially when there's so many ways and there's so many ways to be Indigenous and so many Indigenous perspectives. Yeah, so I leave on that because I hope everyone is encouraged to like go seek out something to watch or read or learn about Indigenous perspectives that are not as mainstream, maybe.
All right, so we are at time. And so I want to again just give one more round of applause to all of our amazing panelists. I also want to give a round of applause to Rachel and Ryan at BELT, as well as the entire staff at BELT for making this possible and helping to make this ongoing series a reality. And so I will turn it over here to Rachel for some closing words.
I just want to thank you all so much. That was really beautiful, powerful, and necessary conversation that I wish we could have so much more of. And I'm just grateful for all the work that you all are doing. And I feel really, really lucky that Belt got to be a part of it. So thank you all. Thank you to everybody who attended. Sorry we went a little bit over, but I think we can all agree that that was worth sticking around for. We didn't even get to all the questions. So to be continued. And if anybody, if the panelists, if you all have websites or work or other publications you want to pop in the chat before people leave, please do that. I'm sure people will want to follow more of your work. So thank you all so much.